Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to episode 48 of Contemplating Life. This week we continue my nostalgic look back at my college days, especially my third semester at IUPUI, and the first woman I ever dated who wasn't in a wheelchair. We left last week's episode on a bit of a cliffhanger, telling you about meeting a woman who was the first able woman I ever dated, the first person in college I ever dated, and a relationship that ended up lasting for decades. If you haven't seen that previous episode, I suggest you go back and pick it up first. There's some things I set up in that episode that pay off this time. I mentioned that we met in the Hideaway Cafeteria in the basement of the Blake Street Library. I would journey there every day after sociology class. I had no trouble getting someone to open the front door of the library or to push the button on the elevator to get to the basement. Now, the Hideaway was a real cafeteria with cafeteria trays and a food service line offering a variety of choices at a decent price. This was unlike the 38th Street K Building lunchroom that had nothing but vending machines. I didn't seem to have any difficulty finding someone who would grab a tray for me and walk through the line with me. I think it was the second or third week of the semester when I was assisted by a rather short, full-figured woman with long black hair. And most people just carried the tray to a table for me and then they went on their way. But she offered to sit down with me for lunch. She explained that we were in sociology class together. Now, there were over 30 people in that class, and I hadn't particularly noticed her. Of course, I wore the same color wheelchair every day, so I was quite familiar to her. I learned that her name was Ella Vinci. That's Vinci as in Leonardo da, but she went by Ellie for short. She was a couple of years older than me, reasonably attractive, but not as hot as some of the women at the downtown campus. From that day forward, we had lunch together almost every day. She was very outgoing and quite kind to me. We would have long discussions about the topics in our social problems class. She was quite liberal politically and a crusader for social justice issues and women's rights issues. Being of Sicilian descent, she was also Roman Catholic. Although I was drifting away from the church at the time, I had not yet left the Catholic Church, so I considered her faith a plus. As a psychology major, it was obvious she cared about people. She was very sensitive towards their feelings. In her spare time, she volunteered to answer a suicide prevention hotline. By helping me with my tray each day, she made sure I got fries with that. It took everything I had not to jump to the conclusion that she was the one I'd been waiting for. I can't say that I actually fell in love with her, but I was quite attracted to her, and I certainly felt the relationship was off to a great start and had lots of potential. Soon after we started hanging out for lunch, we were joined by another of our sociology classmates, a guy named Bill. I don't recall his last name. He was a tall, lanky fellow who was extremely socially awkward. He revealed that he struggled with epilepsy, which he kept mostly under control with medication. Because of his condition, he couldn't get a driver's license. He talked about how difficult that was during high school. Nobody wants to date a guy who can't drive and has the potential to fall down in fits of convulsions at any moment. Naturally, unfortunately, he was teased and bullied throughout his life for his condition. I could commiserate with him about the inability to drive and the adverse effect it had on my high school social life. Several weeks later, one day when Bill wasn't around, Ellie sat down with me, visibly troubled. "I gotta talk to you about Bill. I don't know what to do. He wants me to meet his parents." "Do you mean like introduce you as my friend from school or meet the parents?" "He means meet the parents as in he wants to introduce them to his future wife. She went on to explain the entire extent of their relationship outside our usual three-person lunch date was that one day when it was raining, she took him home to his apartment rather than having him wait on the bus in the rain. They ordered some pizza and sat around watching TV or listening to music. I don't recall what she said they did. She said they sat next to each other on his sofa, and at one point he put his arm around her and tried to grab her breast. She rejected the advance, and he apologized. But from that lone encounter and our shared lunches each day, he was already making wedding plans. I listened attentively and tried not to show what I was feeling inside. A single sentence was screaming inside my head. That sentence was the proverbial, "There but for the grace of God go I." When she concluded her story and asked for my advice, I began explaining to her that Bill's epilepsy was a disability. The social effects of it were not significantly different from what I had experienced. I explained to her it takes willpower and ambition just to believe that you're lovable. You operate under the assumption that if anyone was going to take you seriously as a boyfriend, it would be a very rare thing. So there's pressure to make the absolute most out of even the smallest opportunity. I don't think I had yet thought of the joke about falling in love with the girl at McDonald's who asked if I wanted fries, but I explained the dynamics behind such a situation. I told her, "You're probably the first girl in his entire life who's shown him any kindness whatsoever." And so he felt like he had to jump at the situation full force and push it to extreme expectations. The entire time I was speculating about what was going on inside his head, I was in fact talking about myself. I just kept thinking over and over again how terrifyingly close I had been to making a fool of myself the way that Bill had. Now let me be clear, I really wasn't madly in love with her. However, I was actively pursuing a course of action in which I sincerely hoped that someday she would be meeting my parents in that way. So although I had been keeping a level head and an appropriate perspective about my relationship with Ellie, the similarities to Bill really terrified me. She was amazed at the depth of insight I had into his personality, and she understood better what had happened. She had no idea that those insights were mostly based on my own feelings. After our conversation, she spoke to Bill and made it clear to him she had zero interest. I don't think the three of us ever ate lunch together again after that. I did see Bill one-on-one one time, and he explained to me he felt that he had failed with Ellie because he had tried to put the moves on her on their first date. I didn't bother explaining to him that that wasn't really a date, and furthermore, his issues went way beyond that. If he wanted to believe that version of events, I wasn't going to try to dissuade him from it. Ellie later found out that Bill had found a new girlfriend, and this one didn't hesitate to take him to bed, or so he claimed. The troubling thing was, his new girlfriend was some sort of religious fanatic who didn't believe in medicine, and she was persuading him to stop taking his anti-epilepsy drugs. That was bound to end in disaster. It really concerned both of us, because despite the issues, we really kind of liked the guy. I never did learn what happened after that. Now, the consequence of this entire situation was that it sealed my friendship with her. We grew much closer, and eventually I found the courage to ask her on a date. We went out 3 or 4 times. I think we also might have gotten together in my house on at least one other occasion, Or I may just be remembering things that we did after our dates. I mean, we're talking about events 49 years ago, so my recollection isn't perfect. Our first date was for dinner, and then we went to see Jaws. She had already seen it once, but wanted to see it again. It was the first time for me. The only time I was scared during the movie was when Richard Dreyfuss was inspecting the abandoned boat underwater, and he looks into a hole in the side of the boat. A dead guy's head pops out of the hole with his eyeball hanging out. I flinched along with the entire audience, but even more so because at that instant Ellie grabbed my arm. I said, "You did that just to scare me. You've seen this movie before. You know what was going to happen." She insisted that even though she knew it was coming, it made her jump, and grabbing me was a reflex. Yeah, really. Anyway, we also went to dinner and saw the movie version of the rock opera Tommy by The Who. Unfortunately, I had some bad chicken at dinner, and I was a bit nauseous by the end of the movie, so we didn't hang out for very long afterwards. We also went to see The Godfather Part 2. She said it was about her people, because she was from Sicilian background. Not that she had any mob connections. She was especially shocked at the scene where Kay tells Michael that she didn't have a miscarriage, but it was an abortion. She said for Sicilians, that would be huge. Being Catholic myself, and my mother being staunchly pro-life, I knew what she meant, but Ellie seemed to be especially affected by the scene. I have distinct memories of sitting with her in my room listening to records. I don't know why I recall this one incident so distinctly. We were speculating about the meaning of the lyrics to the song Still You Turn Me On from the Emerson, Lake and Palmer album Brain Salad Surgery. We wondered what did it mean when he says, "Someone get me a ladder." She thought perhaps it was so I can reach you. I thought it was interesting insight. I don't know why I recall that little detail nearly 50 years later. Our most memorable date was when she invited me to my first hockey game. It was the Indianapolis Racers at Market Square Arena. And I've already told you what a sweet and sensitive woman she was, but I've not said that she was also very soft-spoken as well. She had a very gentle personality. That is, except at a hockey game. At a hockey game, an entirely different personality emerged. Now, it was quite common for a fist fight to break out at such a game. This is in the days before helmets were mandatory, and so the fights were particularly nasty. It was a minor league team, and it seemed like they allowed fights to go on a little bit longer than perhaps the NHL would, or at least than they would today. There's an old joke. I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out. It was like there was more fighting than there was hockey. Well, this was one of those games. She would scream and yell and cheer at the fights. Hit him, hit him. She'd also yell at the referees and didn't hesitate to hurl expletives at them. I looked at her like, "Okay, who are you and what did you do with Ellie?" I had a blast. I've been a hockey fan ever since. I've often described her as the woman who taught me a deep appreciation of violence on ice. Ellie didn't make it particularly easy for me to keep my perspective on our relationship. At one point, she took a vacation to Puerto Rico. I don't recall if it was with a girlfriend or a relative. I don't think she went alone. When she returned home, she went on and on about what a beautiful place it was, and speculated perhaps someday we would go there together. She seemed completely oblivious to the challenges that would involve. You know, it's one thing to accept me without regard to my disability, but it's quite another thing to act as if there were no real obstacles involved with that disability. I want to be treated normal, but there's certain realities that you have to face. Her statement about maybe we'll go to Puerto Rico together someday was so completely unrealistic that it was painful for me. If I'd lost my perspective, I could have interpreted it to mean she'd do absolutely anything necessary for us to be together. But fortunately, I recognized it for what it was. She had no realistic concept of what day-to-day life would be with me under normal circumstances, let alone taking an exotic vacation together. I told my dad about the conversation. He was concerned I was developing unrealistic expectations. He said I needed to keep my perspective. He says, with a girl like that, you can have a really nice time with her, but you need to understand the challenges that you're going to face in a relationship. I explained to him that it was quite the contrary. I wasn't getting carried away because I realized how unrealistic she was being about what life would be like with me. She was the one who wasn't keeping perspective. I went on to explain the struggle I faced because I felt finding anyone who would take any interest in me would be extremely rare. I tried to explain to him the pressure I felt to make the very best of every opportunity because I didn't think I'd get a lot of chances. He then quoted me that old adage, "Son, girls are like streetcars. If you miss one, another one comes along in a few minutes." But Dad, there are no more streetcars. Okay, smartass, then buses. It's just an old expression. Yeah, it's an expression I've heard before. But ask yourself, how many of those streetcars or buses are wheelchair accessible? That's pretty rare. I feel like I have to catch every accessible bus that I can. It's just that this bus driver thinks she can take me to Puerto Rico, and I know she can't. When I said how many of the buses are wheelchair accessible, I think Dad finally understood what I was getting at. She brought me a souvenir from Puerto Rico. It was a small brown handmade bud vase. She had placed in the vase a small sprig of plastic artificial lily-of-the-valley flowers that she had doused with her favorite perfume. I swear I could still smell that perfume on the plastic flowers many, many years later. I don't know what kind of perfume it was, but it was distinctly her. I recall one day going to the library and waiting on the elevator, and I thought I smelled her perfume. I looked around the room, and there she was, sitting at a table several feet away. When I returned to the 38th Street campus for my fourth semester, we didn't see much of each other anymore. I would occasionally see her at the downtown campus, and I think she took a couple of classes on 38th Street, but we didn't see much of each other. We remained good friends, but we didn't go out anymore. In 1976, Ellie took a bus trip to New Hampshire to campaign door-to-door for Indiana Senator Birch Bayh in his bid for the Democratic nomination for president. He was one of the most liberal politicians Indiana has ever seen. He was known for his work for equal rights, the ERA. He was author of Title IX and a whole host of other liberal clauses. I encourage you to read the linked Wikipedia article about him. After finishing third in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, he dropped out of the race. Jimmy Carter became the Democrat nominee and the 39th president. Bayh continued to be an influential senator until he was defeated in 1980 by Dan Quayle, who benefited from a Republican landslide that year. On that trip to New Hampshire, Ellie met a guy. They fell in love, and they were married. I was invited to the wedding at the cathedral downtown, and I attended. At the reception afterwards, she gave me a big hug and gave me a small sprig of real lily-of-the-valley flowers from her wedding bouquet. I took it home and put it in the vase from Puerto Rico with the plastic flowers. It sat on a bookshelf in my bedroom for decades. I'm not sure what happened to it, but it's not there now. Maybe I stashed it away somewhere. I don't think I would have thrown it away. Ellie earned her master's degree and went on to work as a family counselor for an organization called Catholic Charities. She and her husband were extremely active in the Catholic Church, and I think they became members of the secular Franciscan order. She had, I believe, 2 daughters. I ran into her once or twice at archdiocesan events. We occasionally spoke by phone. Many years after we went to college together, in one of those phone calls, I took the opportunity to tell her why I had so much insight into what Bill was feeling. I confessed that it was because, to a lesser degree, I was not that different from him. I said I was grateful that I had not gotten out of control, as had Bill. I was grateful for the years of friendship that we had, because I'd been able to keep a proper perspective. I never did tell her how upset I was that she suggested we could have run off to Puerto Rico for a vacation. One time I called her for advice when a friend of mine needed a family lawyer for a custody issue. I thought perhaps because Ellie worked in family counseling, she could recommend someone. It was in that phone call I learned that she had divorced her husband. That really surprised me, considering how devoutly Catholic she was and how difficult it is to be a divorced Catholic. It was 7 years ago, just as I was recovering from getting my trach installed, that I discovered her on Facebook. She had just returned from a vacation in Rome with her daughters. We resumed our friendship online, but she had radically changed since I'd last seen her. You won't believe this, but now she was a Trump supporter. That's why I asked you to read the Wikipedia article about Senator Bai. You could not find 2 people who are at farther ends of the political spectrum than those 2. I can only speculate that her staunch Catholicism led her to be radically anti-abortion, and thus she became Republican despite the conservative positions that were diametrically opposed to all of the social justice and feminist issues that she supported in her college days. We reminisced about the good old days, and I treated her kindly despite her changed political views. I avoided any political discussions with her like, "What the hell happened to you? How could you support Trump?" I just avoided the topic altogether. I knew we could never be really close again. It's not that I can't love a conservative, but I can't respect anyone who supports irrationality like a Trump supporter. I'm guessing it was about halfway through the Trump administration that she announced she was quitting Facebook. She couldn't handle the toxicity, she said. Perhaps she couldn't deal with the reality that Trump was such an irrational, misguided, narcissistic, incompetent idiot. I don't know. She didn't explain why. She certainly wasn't the woman I knew in college, and I miss her. The original her. Very much. I had wasted my relationship with Rosie throughout high school because I constantly lamented that it wasn't a romance, and I had never appreciated Rosie's friendship the way I should have until it was too late. That lesson bore fruit in my relationship with Ellie, and that I could enjoy our friendship even though it wasn't a romance. And thanks to that sad guy Bill, I avoided making a fool of myself by pushing too hard to try to make something happen that wasn't there. I learned not only to allow the friendship to happen, but to be completely fulfilled by that friendship, rather than just seeing it as solely a stepping stone to something else. It was a lesson that served me well in every other relationship I've had with women for the rest of my life. At age 68, with little or no social life beyond some online friends, my chances of finding romance are smaller than ever. That doesn't mean I've given up. I enjoy friendships with women, and I cherish what I have, while keeping my perspective on the difficulties that would be involved in a relationship. I have that perspective in many ways thanks to my experiences with Ellie. As I mentioned previously, we're going to take a break for a few weeks to catch up on some other projects. In early January, I'll return with a political rant about Facebook and other social media. And then we will resume my look back at my college days. Look for my Oscar movie reviews in February and early March. And after I conclude the college series, we'll probably explore the first job I ever had. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I'm struggling financially right now, I'm not really in this for the money. But still, every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to all of my financial supporters. Your support pays for the writing seminar I attend and other things. But most of all, it shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. That means more to me than I could ever express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, as always, I'm begging you, please post links and share this podcast on Facebook or other social media so that I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All of my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find the podcast. A very Merry Christmas and a blessed and safe New Year to all of you. I'll see you next week. I'll see you next year as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.